The quality of your life is in large part determined by what you consistently pay attention to. Attention is not just a casual habit, it is a neural function. At any given moment, your brain is bombarded with sensory input. Sounds, sights, emotions, physical sensations, notifications, conversations, and internal thoughts. But the brain does not treat all of this input equally. It filters, selects, and amplifies based on where you choose to place your attention. That decision to focus on yourself or on distractions literally reshapes your neural pathways. From a neuroscience standpoint, attention is regulated primarily through the prefrontal cortex, particularly the dorsolateral and ventromedial regions. These regions are responsible for executive functions like planning, impulse control, and long-term decision making. When you focus deeply on your own growth, these circuits become more efficient. The brain essentially says, "This is important. Let's wire for more of this." The result is a self-reinforcing loop of cognitive efficiency and behavioral alignment. Now contrast that with the typical day of someone who never guards their focus. They wake up and scroll social media. Their attention is split between half-finished tasks and conversations that hold no depth. They consume random information, react to minor opinions, and respond emotionally to noise that has nothing to do with their mission. Over time, their attention system becomes fragmented. Their brain is constantly in a reactive state. The neural circuits that support deep work and self-discipline begin to atrophy from lack of use. They are no longer designing their life, they are simply reacting to it. What most people don't realize is that attention is a limited, energy-consuming process. The more often you divide your focus, the more cognitive fatigue you accumulate. This leads to decision fatigue, poor self-control, anxiety, and eventually burnout. But when you focus on yourself, on your goals, your values, your habits, you enter what researchers refer to as a flow-conducive state. Your cognitive resources align toward a singular purpose, and your neurobiology rewards you for it. What you focus on also determines what becomes salient to the brain. Salience is the brain's way of tagging something as important. If you constantly focus on comparison, gossip, or approval, your brain becomes wired to seek those inputs again and again. But if you focus on self-discipline, physical health, learning, and emotional regulation, those behaviors become easier to access. Your identity then is not fixed, it is shaped through repetitive attention. This is also why silence is not just peaceful, it is powerful. In silence, you strip away the noise that competes for your neural bandwidth. Without the flood of sensory distractions, your brain naturally reorients toward your inner goals. It begins to strengthen the pathways that reflect your core direction. The absence of stimulation gives the brain room to deepen the very circuits that produce clarity, creativity, and emotional resilience. There's a phenomenon called neuroplasticity, which is the brain's ability to change its wiring based on experience. Every moment you consciously direct your focus inward to your routines, your standards, your growth, you are triggering this process. Neurons that fire together wire together. So when you repeatedly focus on progress, the brain forms stronger synaptic connections around behaviors that lead to achievement. These changes aren't philosophical, they are measurable physiological transformations in the brain. In practice, this means that choosing silence and solitude isn't passive, it's an active strategy to optimize brain function. It's in those quiet moments of self-focus that your memory consolidates, your stress hormones stabilize, and your dopamine system calibrates for longer-term rewards. The individual who understands this doesn't chase attention, they channel it inward. And as a result, their life begins to organize itself around what truly matters, not what merely distracts. Dopamine is one of the most misunderstood chemicals in the human brain. Most people assume it's about pleasure, but in truth, dopamine is about motivation, drive, and the anticipation of reward. It's the neurochemical that keeps you pursuing a goal, striving toward the next level, and showing up day after day with energy and direction. But the source of that dopamine matters more than most people realize. The difference between external dopamine and internally generated dopamine can determine whether your brain is wired for distraction or long-term progress. When you seek validation from others, likes on a post, attention in a conversation, or constant acknowledgement from peers, you're activating the brain's reward system in short, sharp bursts. This system involves the mesolimbic pathway, particularly the nucleus accumbens, which lights up when something novel, exciting, or socially validating occurs. But this kind of dopamine hit is fleeting. It feels good for a moment, then quickly fades, and the brain craves more. Over time, it becomes a compulsive loop of checking, comparing, and performing. And each time you feed that loop, your baseline levels of dopamine drop. You need more stimulation to feel the same drive. Eventually, nothing feels meaningful unless it's seen, liked, or praised by others. That's the trap of externally sourced dopamine. It builds dependency on the reactions of other people. It pulls your attention away from your inner goals and places your value in the hands of others. In contrast, internally generated dopamine, the kind that comes from silent effort, from pushing through resistance, from doing the right thing when no one is watching, is far more sustainable and far more powerful for building long-term success. When you quietly wake up early to train your body or develop your mind, when you stick to your plan even though no one will clap for it, your brain registers that action as aligned with your purpose. This activates a different set of circuits, the mesocortical pathway, which connects the ventral tegmental area to the prefrontal cortex. These are the pathways associated with long-term thinking, delayed gratification, and personal growth. Every time you take a disciplined action in silence, you're reinforcing these circuits. You're training your brain to value process over praise. That is the true essence of self-driven progress. The science behind it is clear. Dopamine that is internally generated through effort builds resilience. When you reward yourself mentally for staying consistent, for finishing a workout, for sticking to a difficult task, your brain learns to associate effort with satisfaction. This is what behavioral scientists call reward prediction error, when the brain starts expecting a reward not from outcome, but from action itself. That means your effort becomes the reward. And when effort becomes the reward, you can outlast anyone who's only motivated by applause. Silence plays a critical role in this process. When you remove yourself from noise, from constant updates, from notifications, from reactive conversations, you give your dopamine system a chance to reset. Most people are overstimulated. Their dopamine system is constantly chasing novelty, which actually lowers baseline motivation over time. But when you practice stillness and focused solitude, your brain begins to normalize again. It becomes more sensitive to subtle rewards, like the satisfaction of finishing a chapter, completing a set, or holding a commitment. This is why the most driven individuals often operate quietly. They understand that silence shields their momentum. It gives them space to build without interference. It allows their brain to shift from chasing external outcomes to generating internal momentum. And that shift is the foundation for deep, lasting transformation. It is also the reason why sustainable success often appears invisible at first. It's built in the hours no one sees, fueled by dopamine no one gives you, generated by discipline no one applauds, cultivated in silence no one interrupts, and strengthened by focus no one can take away from you because it comes from within. The environment you place yourself in is not neutral. It is either constructing the architecture of your brain to support your highest potential, or it's subtly eroding your focus, energy, and discipline. Most people underestimate how profoundly their surroundings influence the way their nervous system functions. But from a neuroscientific perspective, your environment is one of the most powerful sculptors of your attention, behavior, and identity. Every external cue you're exposed to, every face, every voice, every sound, every notification sends a signal to your brain. These signals either align with your goals or they compete against them. Over time, they condition your internal state. The brain operates based on patterns. What you repeatedly expose it to becomes what it expects. So if your environment is filled with noise, comparison, distraction, and emotional volatility, your brain begins to adapt to that. The amygdala becomes hyper-responsive. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for logic, decision-making, and willpower, begins to burn out under constant demands for attention shifting. There is a principle in neuroscience called experience, degree, degrowth, and plasticity. This means that the brain changes in response to the inputs it receives most consistently. If your daily inputs are chaotic, disorganized, or superficial, your brain becomes optimized for chaos, distraction, and surface level thinking. But if your environment promotes silence, focus, minimalism, and depth, your brain begins to reinforce neural pathways that support those behaviors. You literally begin to wire your mind for clarity and endurance simply by choosing where you spend your time and who you allow into your cognitive space. Even subtle environmental factors, like the presence of your phone, open tabs on your screen, clutter in your room, or background conversations, can create micro disruptions in your focus. Each of those moments forces your brain to reallocate attention, burning valuable glucose and reducing your ability to stay locked in on your goals. That's why high performers often curate their environment with intense precision. They know it's not about being overly rigid, it's about protecting the bandwidth of the brain. When you focus on yourself and stay silent, you're not just avoiding noise for the sake of peace, you're giving your neural circuits the space to integrate. Silence is not a passive state. It is an active optimization tool for the brain. In silence, the default mode network of the brain becomes active. This is the network involved in self-reflection, memory consolidation, and future planning. It's only accessible when you're not overloaded with external stimulation. That means your best ideas, your most honest self-assessments, and your deepest motivation come not in the middle of a noisy crowd, but in the quiet moments where you can hear your own mind. The people you surround yourself with are also part of your environment, and their impact is just as significant. Neuroscience shows that we mirror the emotions, speech patterns, even brain rhythms of the people closest to us, a process known as interpersonal neural entrainment. If you're constantly surrounded by people who doubt themselves, procrastinate, gossip, or settle, your nervous system begins to sync with that energy. But when you're around disciplined, calm, self-respecting individuals, even if only digitally through books, lectures, or focused content, your brain picks up on that structure. You begin to absorb those patterns of behavior subconsciously. It's not enough to have ambition internally if your environment contradicts it externally. Your surroundings need to reflect your standards. And often that means subtracting more than it means adding. Remove noise, remove low-quality conversations, remove clutter, remove digital distractions, remove people who drain your mental energy. Each subtraction creates room in your cognitive landscape for deeper attention, for sharper decision-making, for heightened awareness. The more silence and intentionality you inject into your environment, the more neural space you give yourself to build the architecture of the future version of you that you're becoming. Your environment is not just where you live, it's what your brain learns to call normal. So build that normal around focus, resilience, and internal drive instead of noise, reaction, and emotional volatility. In moments of emotional intensity, uncertainty, or conflict, the nervous system is forced to respond. For most people, this response is reactive. They speak impulsively, act defensively, or seek immediate stimulation to avoid discomfort. But there is another kind of response that is far more powerful and far more rare: the decision to remain silent. Silence in high-stress moments is not avoidance. It is a form of neurological control. It is resilience made visible. The human brain is wired to seek resolution. When tension arises, the limbic system, particularly the amygdala, activates a cascade of responses designed for survival: fight, flight, or freeze. These responses are rapid, emotional, and unconscious. In ancient times, they were essential, but in today's world where survival is rarely physical and far more often psychological, these automatic patterns can do more harm than good. They lead to impulsive words, broken focus, and weakened decision-making. The person who learns to hold silence in those moments is not suppressing emotion. They are rewiring their brain's automatic reactions. There's a term in neuroscience called top-down regulation. This refers to the process where higher-level brain regions, especially the prefrontal cortex, exert control over lower emotional brain regions. Silence creates space for this top-down regulation to occur. When you choose to remain silent instead of reacting, you're engaging your brain time to assess, recalibrate, and make a conscious choice rather than an impulsive one. This doesn't make you passive, it makes you strategic. It trains your brain to operate above its emotional circuitry rather than being controlled by it. Silent restraint is not the absence of thought, it is the application of awareness. It is using the breath to slow the heart rate. It is observing the internal signal without obeying it. It is turning emotional momentum into mental clarity. Over time, this becomes a trait. The more you practice it, the more the neural pathways for self-control and emotional regulation strengthen. What once triggered you becomes something you can witness without reacting. What once derailed your focus becomes background noise that you know how to ignore. The very act of staying silent in moments where others would speak becomes a kind of internal weightlifting for your mind. This form of resilience is not visible to most people because it doesn't announce itself. It happens in the seconds where you pause before responding. It happens when you delay an argument you would have rushed into. It happens when you walk away from a conversation that offers no value to your mission. It's invisible to others, but transformational to your neural circuitry. You're training your insula, the part of the brain involved in self-awarenesses, to recognize what's happening inside your body without needing to externalize it. And you're strengthening your anterior cingulate cortex, which is responsible for cognitive control, decision-making, and emotional suppression of reactive impulses. In silence, the nervous system has room to regulate. The body's stress hormones, cortisol, adrenaline begin to drop, heart rate variability improves, breathing deepens, and the parasympathetic nervous system, which is responsible for recovery and restoration, begins to take over. This is not just about mental toughness. It is a biological recalibration that supports physical health, longevity, and peak performance. It is the physiological manifestation of psychological mastery. Choosing silence also signals to your own subconscious mind that you are in control. It teaches your internal world that you do not need to react to every stimulus, that you are not a puppet of your surroundings, that you are capable of observing, absorbing, and adapting without being broken by what's happening around you. It sends a message to your internal belief system that you are stronger than your impulses, more stable than your emotions, and more committed to your long-term vision than your short-term discomfort. There is a widespread misconception in the modern world that solitude equals loneliness, that if you're not constantly surrounded by people, activity, and stimulation, something must be wrong. But neuroscience tells a very different story. Time alone is not a state of lack, it's a state of processing. It's where the brain takes raw experience and turns it into wisdom. It's where emotion meets understanding and where attention reorganizes itself around clarity and direction. Time spent alone, especially in silence, is not isolation. It is neurological integration. At the core of this process is what neuroscientists call the default mode network, DMN. This network activates when you're not focused on external tasks, when your mind is at rest, not distracted, and not reacting to outside inputs. It's in these moments that the brain shifts from problem solving to meaning making. The DMN connects the medial prefrontal cortex, posterior cingulate cortex, and parts of the temporal lobes. These regions are associated with introspection, self-awarenessness, and autobiographical memory. In other words, when you're alone and quiet, your brain isn't doing nothing. It's doing some of the most important work it can do. Integration happens in silence. After intense focus, stress, or emotional challenges, your nervous system needs space to decompress and reorganize. If you never allow yourself this space, the brain has no time to absorb what just happened. You just move from one task, one conversation, one screen to the next. Over time, this leads to mental clutter, decision fatigue, and emotional confusion. But when you intentionally create time to be alone, to remove external noise, the brain begins to sort through the data. It begins to connect past experiences with current goals. It identifies what to keep, what to discard, and what to refine. This process is foundational to learning, resilience, and self-awareness. Solitude also allows for emotional regulation in the presence of others, especially in socially demanding environments. The brain is constantly monitoring, responding, and adapting. This social mirroring consumes significant cognitive resources. But when you step away from those external demands, the body's sympathetic nervous system, responsible for stress and alertness, can step back, and the parasympathetic system takes over. This shift allows for emotional decompression. You begin to feel what you were too busy to feel. You begin to name emotions you had been carrying unconsciously. And once they're named, the brain can begin to resolve them. Emotional clarity is not found in noise. It is found in stillness. There is also a neurological advantage to self-dialogue during periods of solitude. When you are alone, your inner voice becomes clearer. You begin to have conversations with yourself about your standards, your goals, your discipline, and your value. These internal dialogues strengthen the connectivity between different regions of the prefrontal cortex. They help align intention with behavior. And over time, this alignment builds integrity. Not the moral kind of integrity, but the neurological kind. The sense that your thoughts, emotions, and actions are synchronized. Most people don't integrate because they don't pause. They're addicted to movement, stimulation, and distraction. But growth isn't linear. It's cyclical. You need cycles of action and cycles of reflection. You need effort and integration. You need silence as much as you need strategy. Time alone is the container where ideas mature, decisions crystallize, and emotional turbulence settles into insight. And the deeper you go into silence, the more refined your self-awareness becomes. The brain also consolidates learning during periods of quiet. Memory formation doesn't just occur when you study or experience something new. It occurs when your brain has time to process and replay it. This is why reflection enhances retention. This is why walking alone, journaling in solitude, or sitting in stillness often leads to breakthroughs that chaotic environments could never produce. Your brain is always working, but the quality of its work improves when it's not under constant siege by external input. Time alone gives the brain the operating space to turn experience into structure, to shape identity out of information, to replace reactive behavior with thoughtful, self-aligned patterns. What feels like silence on the outside is on the inside. One of the most active and essential neural processes you can engage in when building a focused, resilient, and self-directed life. Discipline is often misrepresented. In most public narratives, it's portrayed as loud, aggressive, and on display, grinding in the gym, announcing routines, broadcasting achievements. But the most powerful discipline is almost always invisible. It happens in silence, behind closed doors, in early mornings and late nights when no one is looking. From a neuroscience perspective, this kind of consistent, low-friction repetition doesn't just change behavior, it rewires the very architecture of the brain. It builds a foundation so strong that success becomes a byproduct of the system, not just a matter of willpower. The brain is a pattern recognition machine. Every time you engage in a behavior, you're not just completing an action, you're strengthening neural circuits. These circuits, composed of billions of neurons, form pathways that determine how easily and automatically you can repeat the same action in the future. This process is known as Hebbian learning, often summarized by the phrase, neurons that fire together wire together. Invisible discipline leverages this principle. The more often you execute the same disciplined action, waking up early, completing a workout, planning your day, finishing what you started, the more fluent your nervous system becomes in those patterns. Eventually, what once required effort becomes automatic. What makes this transformation so powerful is that it doesn't rely on external validation. Most people unknowingly tie their habits to recognition. They do things well, but only when someone is watching. This creates a dopamine loop that is externally dependent. When the recognition disappears, so does the motivation. But when you practice discipline in silence, the brain begins to reward itself from within. This internally generated dopamine, released from the ventral tegmental area and acting in the prefrontal cortex and striatum, becomes associated not with applause, but with effort itself. You start to feel satisfaction not because someone acknowledged you, but because you held the line with yourself. This is the biochemical foundation of true intrinsic motivation. Invisible discipline also strengthens the anterior cingulate cortex, a region responsible for monitoring conflict and managing attention. Every time you resist a distraction and return to your task, this part of your brain gets stronger. Over time, it builds what's called cognitive control, the ability to stay on course in the presence of competing impulses. This is the neural basis of consistency, and consistency over time always outpaces intensity. 100 silent days of practice are more effective than one loud day of performance. The brain doesn't care how dramatic your effort looks, it cares how consistent the input is. In silence, the stakes are internal. The win is in the action, not in the reaction. You stop performing for others and start performing for your future self. This activates another crucial brain area, the medial prefrontal cortex, which plays a central role in imagining the future and aligning your current decisions with long-term outcomes. When you visualize the benefits of your silent efforts, how they compound over time, you increase the probability of following through. You create coherence between your present behavior and your future identity. This is where neuroplasticity aligns with purpose. Purpose, the most durable forms of discipline are built through repetition under low reward, when no one sees you and you still show up, when you get no praise and you still push forward, when the results are slow and you still trust the process. This low stimulation environment trains the brain to detach effort from emotion and